In a time long before the world knew what true darkness looked like, there was a city that felt like a dream. This was Prague, a place filled with spires that touched the sky and bridges that crossed over a river reflecting the moonlight. In this beautiful city lived a woman named Alice. She wasn't just anyone. She was a pianist, and to her, the world wasn't made of concrete and walls, but of melodies and rhythms. Her life was wrapped in music. It was the air she breathed. Alice lived in a cozy apartment that always smelled of coffee and old books. But mostly, it smelled of music. Every morning, she would sit at her grand piano, a beautiful black beast that took up half the room. When her fingers touched the ivory keys, the house would wake up. Her little son, Raphael, used to hide under the piano when she played. He loved the feeling of the vibrations traveling through the floorboards into his small body. It made him feel safe. It made him feel like he was part of the song. Back then, life had a special kind of silence. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a peaceful one. It was the silence between the notes in a song. Alice was known in the city. People came from all over to hear her play. The concert halls were bright, filled with chandeliers that sparkled like stars. When Alice walked onto the stage, the crowd would stop talking. That was the good kind of stillness, the kind where hundreds of people hold their breath because they are waiting for something magical to happen. And then, her hands would move. The music would flow out, sometimes fast and angry like a storm, sometimes slow and sad like a goodbye. But it was always beautiful. In those days, her biggest worry was whether she had practiced enough, or if she had remembered to buy apples for Raphael on her way home. They had friends who were writers, scientists, and other musicians. They would sit in their living rooms, discussing art and philosophy late into the night. They laughed. They drank tea. They thought this life would go on forever. But outside that warm apartment, something ugly was beginning to grow. It didn't happen all at once. It was like a cold draft that slowly seeps under a door in the winter. At first, it was just whispers. People on the street started looking over their shoulders. The friendly shopkeeper who always gave Raphael a sweet stopped smiling. The do not enter signs started appearing on parks and benches, signs that said certain people weren't welcome anymore. Alice saw the change. But like many others, she couldn't believe it would really touch her. How could hate exist in a city so full of culture? How could anyone want to hurt people who just wanted to play music and raise their children? But the silence of the city began to change. The happy, busy noise of the streets turned into a nervous, quiet shuffle. No one wanted to draw attention to themselves. The laughter in the concert halls became quieter, more forced. One day, the reality came crashing through their door. It wasn't a loud crash at first. It was a series of small cruelties. They were told they couldn't go to the cinema. They were told they couldn't sit on the benches by the river. Then they were told they couldn't work. Alice's world, which was built on sharing her art with the public, suddenly hit a wall. The piano in her living room became her only escape. She played more than ever, not for an audience, but for her son and herself. She played to keep the fear away. Then came the worst day of all. The sounds outside weren't just quiet anymore. They were sharp and terrifying. The sound of heavy boots marching on the cobblestones, the sound of shouting megaphones, the sound of neighbors packing bags in a hurry, trying not to cry loud enough to be heard. The soldiers came with lists. They had names on papers, cold and impersonal. They didn't care about Alice's talent. They didn't care that she could make a piano sing. They only saw what was written in their logbooks. The order came that they had to leave. They were allowed to take very little. Alice looked around her home, the home filled with memories of music and laughter. She looked at her books, her furniture, and most painfully, her piano. She couldn't take the piano. She could only take the music in her head. The process of leaving was a blur of fear. Raphael was confused. He held onto his mother's hand tight. "Where are we going, Mama?" he asked. Alice didn't have a good answer. She just squeezed his hand and said, "We are going on an adventure." She had to lie to protect him. She had to hide the terror in her own heart. As they walked out of the building and down the street, the city looked different. The beautiful spires were still there, but the color had drained out of the world. The familiar streets felt hostile. The people they passed wouldn't look them in the eye. Some looked sorry, but most just looked scared for themselves. The silence that Alice used to love, the peaceful silence of the concert halls, was gone. In its place was a heavy, suffocating stillness. It was the silence of a city holding its breath, afraid to speak, afraid to help, afraid to exist. They were herded towards a large, dirty transport train. This wasn't a train for travel. It was a train for moving cargo. Human cargo. The air smelled of steel and unwashed bodies. The noise was chaotic. Shouting, dogs barking, babies crying. It was the complete opposite of the harmonious world Alice lived in just days ago, when the heavy metal doors of the train car slammed shut. The sunlight disappeared. It was dark, cramped, and hot. Alice sat on the floor, pulling Raphael onto her lap. The silence of the past felt like a distant memory. Now, there was only the clanking of the wheels on the tracks and the sound of people trying not to panic. The journey had begun, and Alice knew that the life she knew was over. She wasn't a famous pianist anymore. In the eyes of the people taking her away, she was nothing. But as the train lurched forward, leaving the beautiful city of Prague behind, Alice closed her eyes. She couldn't play the piano, but she could hear it. In her mind, she played a sonata by Beethoven. She focused on every note, every chord. She replayed the feeling of the keys under her fingers. She knew that to survive the darkness that was coming, she had to keep the music alive inside her. The room had gone still, the world had gone quiet, but inside her, the music played on. The journey inside the dark train car felt like it lasted an eternity. There were no windows to see the passing world, only small cracks near the ceiling that let in thin lines of dirty light. The air inside was thick and heavy. It smelled of fear, of sweat, and of the bucket in the corner that served as a toilet. It was hard to breathe. Every time the train stopped, which happened often, everyone inside would hold their breath. They would listen to the heavy boots of soldiers walking by outside, wondering if the doors would open and what would happen next. Alice sat on the wooden floor, her legs cramped and numb. She had Raphael on her lap. He was small for his age, and he shivered even though it wasn't cold outside. Alice wrapped her arms tightly around him, trying to pass her own body heat to him. She hummed a soft melody, a lullaby he used to love. It was the only thing she could do to drown out the sounds of the other people crying and coughing in the darkness. She needed to be strong for him. She couldn't let him see her cry. Even though tears were streaming down her own face in the dark, the noise of the train wheels on the tracks was a constant, rhythmic clatter. Clack, clack, clack. It was a harsh sound, nothing like the beautiful rhythm of a waltz or the soft beat of a lullaby. The sound was cold and mechanical. It felt like the world was breaking apart with every turn of the wheels. Alice tried to close her eyes and imagine she was back in her living room in Prague. She tried to picture the sunlight hitting the plants in the window, but the smell of the train and the trembling of the boy in her arms always brought her back to the horrible reality after what felt like days. The train finally screeched to a halt. The noise stopped instantly, replaced by a silence that was even scarier. Then, the heavy metal doors were thrown open. The bright light of day rushed in, blinding everyone who had been in the dark for so long. Soldiers were shouting orders in a harsh language. They were barking like dogs, waving guns and batons, telling everyone to get out quickly. There was no time to stretch or to gather thoughts. It was just chaos. Alice grabbed Raphael's hand. It was tiny and cold. "Stay close to me," she whispered. "No matter what, do not let go of my hand." They stepped down from the train onto a dirt platform. The air here smelled different. It smelled of old stones, wet wood, and something else, something like sickness. They were in a place called Dersenstadt. It was an old fortress town, but it didn't look like a town anymore. It looked like a prison. Everywhere Alice looked, there were people. Thousands of them. They were crowded behind barbed wire fences, or walking in long, tired lines. They looked like ghosts. Their faces were gray, their eyes were hollow, and their clothes hung loosely on their thin bodies. It was a shocking sight. Just a few days ago, Alice was living in a city where people dressed in suits and dresses, where children played in parks. Now, everyone looked the same, dirty, tired, and terrified. The noise was overwhelming. It wasn't the happy noise of a market or the music of a concert. It was a jumble of shouting guards, crying babies, and people calling out names, trying to find their family members who had been separated on the train. It was a deafening wall of sound that made Alice want to cover her ears. But she had to focus. She had to keep moving forward because if she stopped, a soldier might push her or hit her. They were herded into a large, dusty courtyard. The sun was beating down, making the air hot and stifling. They stood there for hours, waiting, just waiting. No one told them what was going to happen. This was the hardest part for Alice, the not knowing. Her mind started to race with terrible thoughts. Would they be fed? Where would they sleep? Would they be safe? Finally, an officer with a clipboard walked down the line. He didn't look at people's faces. He just looked at his papers and pointed. You go there. You go there. He pointed Alice and Raphael toward a group of mostly women and children. They were marched toward a large brick building. It looked like an old army barracks. As they got closer, Alice saw that the windows were barred with iron. When they stepped inside the building, the smell hit them like a punch. It was the smell of too many people living in a small space with no fresh air. It was the smell of unwashed bodies and dirty clothes. They were led up narrow, creaking stairs to a large attic room. It was dark and crowded. There were bunk beds stacked 3 high, but there were no mattresses. Just wooden slats. There was no room for privacy. People were already living there, squeezed together like sardines in a tin. Alice found a small spot on a top bunk near the ceiling. It wasn't really a bed for 2 people, but she and Raphael were small. They climbed up the ladder and sat down. Raphael looked around with wide eyes. He didn't say a word. He just held on to his mother's arm. The room was never quiet. Even at night, when the lights were turned out, the room was alive with noise. People coughed, moaned in their sleep, and whispered to each other in the dark. The walls were so thin that you could hear everything happening in the stairwell and the rooms next door. The sounds of the city, the birds, the cars, the music were gone. They were replaced by the sounds of suffering. Alice quickly learned the rules of this new world. Hunger was the biggest rule. The food they were given was watery soup, made from potato peels or old vegetables. It had almost no taste. Once a day, they got a small piece of bread that was hard as a rock. Alice would take her piece and break it in half. She always gave the slightly bigger half to Raphael. "You are growing," she would tell him with a smile, even though her own stomach was growling in pain. "You need the energy." But the hunger for food was not the only hunger. Alice was hungry for beauty. She was hungry for the sound of music. The world around her was gray and ugly. The buildings were crumbling. The clothes were rags. The faces were sad. It was a place where joy went to die. Alice felt that if she didn't find something beautiful, something to hold on to, her spirit would crumble, just like the walls around her. Days turned into weeks. The routine was always the same. Wake up early, stand in line for water, stand in line for food, stand in line for the bathroom. Then hours of empty time sitting in the crowded room. The boredom was almost as bad as the hunger. It gave people too much time to think about the past and worry about the future. Alice watched the people around her. Some gave up. They would lie on their bunks and stare at the ceiling, refusing to talk or eat. They let the darkness take them. Alice knew she couldn't do that. She had Raphael. She had to be an example for him. She had to show him that even in the middle of this nightmare, life was worth living. One evening, as the sun was setting and casting long shadows through the barred windows, the noise in the barracks shifted. It didn't get quiet, but the mood changed. An older woman sitting near the window started to cough violently. She was very sick. Everyone stopped what they were doing and looked. In the outside world, someone would call a doctor. Here, people just watched with sad, helpless eyes. The woman eventually stopped coughing and lay back, exhausted. A young girl who couldn't have been more than 10 sat next to her and stroked her hair. In that moment of sadness, Alice saw something amazing. The girl started to sing. It was a quiet, weak voice, but it was clear. She sang a folk song, a simple tune about a little bird. The room didn't go silent, but the harsh edge of the noise softened. People stopped arguing about food. They stopped complaining about the guards. For a moment, they listened. It was just a tiny spark of light in a very dark room. Alice closed her eyes and listened. It wasn't a piano, and it wasn't a perfect performance, but it was music. It was a reminder that the human spirit was still alive in that place. Alice looked at Raphael. He was listening to... A small smile appeared on his face. It was the first time he had smiled since they left Prague. That smile gave Alice strength. She realized that music wasn't just a luxury for the rich or the happy. Music was essential. It was like medicine. It was food for the soul. She knew then that she couldn't just wait for the war to end. She had to make music happen. She had to find a way to play. If a little girl could sing with that sick woman, surely Alice could find a way to bring more music to this place. She needed to feel the keys under her fingers again. She needed to turn this noise of suffering into something else. She needed to turn it into a song that would help them all survive another day. The noise of the camp continued outside, the shouting, the dogs, the trains, coming and going. But inside Alice, a plan was forming. She wasn't going to let the silence of despair win. She was going to fight back with the only weapon she had, her music. She didn't know how yet, and she didn't know if she would survive, but she knew she had to try. The room was cold and ugly, but she was determined to bring it to life. The days that followed their arrival at the fortress began to blur together. It was hard to tell one day from the next, because every day was exactly the same. The sun would come up, but it didn't bring warmth. It just showed the dust and the grime of the place a little more clearly. The morning started with the loud banging of doors and the shouting of guards. Everyone would stumble out of their bunks, their bones aching from the hard wooden slats. They stood in long lines for roll call, standing for hours in the cold wind. Waiting for names to be counted, Alice learned to keep her head down. She learned to make herself small. She held Raphael's hand tightly during these lines, squeezing his fingers to let him know she was there. Raphael was quiet most of the time. He didn't run or play like a normal boy. He watched everything with big, serious eyes. He saw the old men stumbling, the mothers crying silently, and the guards with their guns. Alice tried to shield him, but she couldn't build a wall high enough to block out everything. Despite the hunger and the fear, fire was burning inside Alice. It was a small fire, but it refused to go out. After the incident in the barracks where the little girl sang, Alice knew she had to do something. She couldn't just sit and wait for the end. She needed to find a piano. It sounded like a crazy idea. In a place where people were starving and freezing, looking for a piano seemed foolish. But Alice knew that music was the only thing that made sense to her. It was the language she spoke best. She started to listen more carefully to the whispers around her. In the camp, information traveled like a secret river. People whispered about food, about the war, and about the special barracks. She heard rumors that there was a building where the Nazis allowed some cultural activities. It sounded strange. Why would they allow music in a place like this? But Alice knew it was true. The Nazis wanted to fool the world. They wanted to pretend that this place was a model city where people lived happily. So, they allowed some prisoners to paint, to write, and maybe even to play music. Alice knew she had to find this place. One afternoon, when there was a brief break between work details, she asked an older woman who seemed to know everything about the camp. The woman looked at Alice with tired eyes and pointed toward a large yellow building at the edge of the compound. "They say there is a room with instruments there," the woman whispered, "but it is locked most of the time. Only the chosen ones can go in." Alice didn't care if she was chosen. She decided she had to try. She kissed Raphael on the forehead and told him to stay with their bunkmates. "I will be back soon," she promised. "I'm going to find something for us." She walked across the muddy yard, trying to look like she knew where she was going. She passed groups of men working with shovels, their faces gray with dust. She passed laundry lines hung with thin, tattered clothes waving in the wind. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke. When she reached the yellow building, it felt different. It was quieter here. She walked up the stairs, her legs weak from hunger. She walked down a long hallway until she heard it. It was a faint sound, like a ghost. It was the sound of a violin playing a sad, lonely melody. Alice followed the sound until she reached a door. She knocked softly. The music stopped. A man opened the door. He looked surprised to see her. Behind him, Alice saw a room that was filled with a few chairs and some music stands. "I am Alice," she said, her voice trembling a little. "I am a pianist." "From Prague." The man looked at her hands. They were rough now, and the fingernails were dirty, but they were still the hands of a musician. He stepped aside and let her in. He told her that a group of musicians had managed to salvage some instruments from the city before they were brought here. They kept them hidden in a back room, afraid the guards would take them away or destroy them. "Is there a piano?" Alice asked, barely daring to hope. The man nodded and led her to a smaller room in the back of the building. It was a cold, damp room with a small window covered in grime. And there, in the corner, sat a piano. It wasn't her beautiful black grand piano from Prague. It was an old upright, painted a dull brown. It looked tired. The wood was scratched, and some of the keys were chipped. It sat in the shadows like a forgotten friend. Alice walked toward it slowly. She felt tears prickling in her eyes. She reached out and touched the cold wood. It felt real. She lifted the lid that covered the keys. The keys were yellowed with age. It looked like it hadn't been played in years. "Can I play?" she asked the man. "We have no sheet music," he said, "and it is badly out of tune, and we are not allowed to be here for long." "I don't need music," Alice said. "I have it in here." She pointed to her head. "And I don't care if it is out of tune. I just need to play." The man agreed to let her play for a few minutes. He stood by the door to keep watch in case a guard walked by. Alice sat down on the small, hard bench. It wobbled a bit under her weight. She took a deep breath. She placed her fingers on the keys. They felt stiff and unyielding. For a moment, she was scared. She was scared that she had forgotten how to play. She was scared that her hands were too weak. But then, she pressed down on the first chord. The sound that came out was not perfect. The piano was indeed out of tune. Some strings were rusty and buzzed when hit. But to Alice, it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. It was a sound that belonged to the world of the living, not this world of shadows. She closed her eyes and blocked out the cold room, the grime on the window, and the guard outside. She started to play a piece by batch. It was complex and required discipline. Her fingers moved slowly at first, finding their way. Then the muscle memory took over. Her fingers danced across the keys, hitting the wrong note sometimes, but correcting them instantly. She poured all her hunger, her fear, and her love for Raphael into the music. She played about the beauty of the past and the hope for the future. As she played, the cold room seemed to disappear. The man at the door stopped looking nervous. He closed his eyes and listened. The music floated out of the room and into the hallway. It was a sound that didn't belong in a concentration camp. It was a sound of defiance. It said, "I am here. I am a human being. You cannot break me." Alice played until her fingers hurt. She played until her arms ached. She played because for the first time in weeks, she felt like Alice again. She wasn't just prisoner number 555, she was a musician. She was an artist. When she finally stopped, the silence in the room was heavy. It wasn't the same silence as before. It was a peaceful silence. The man opened his eyes and looked at her with respect. "You have a gift," he said quietly. "You must come back. We need this. The people here need this." Alice walked back to the barracks that evening with a lightness in her step that hadn't been there before. She found Raphael waiting for her, his face lighting up when he saw her. "Mama, did you find it?" She sat down next to him and took his hands. "I did," she said. "It is old and it is ugly, but it sings, and I am going to play it again." Over the next few weeks, Alice became a regular visitor to the Yellow Building. She made a deal with the other musicians. They would let her practice in exchange for her promising to perform for them. It wasn't easy to get there. She had to sneak away or ask for permission, which was rarely given. But she found ways. She traded her bread ration sometimes just to have an hour of peace in that room. The piano became her sanctuary. When she sat on that wobbly bench, the hunger pains seemed to fade into the background. The cold air didn't feel so cold. She practiced scales and arpeggios, trying to build back the strength in her fingers. She played Beethoven, Schumann, and Chopin. She memorized every note because there was no music paper allowed. She noticed that the piano was slowly getting better, too. The musicians had managed to find some tools to fix the sticky keys. They oiled the pedals. It was a group effort to keep the instrument alive. They treated it like a precious treasure because, in a way, it was. It was their only link to civilization. One day, as Alice was playing, a guard walked past the open door. Usually, this meant trouble. Alice froze, her hands hovering over the keys. But the guard didn't yell. He didn't hit her. He stopped for a moment and listened. He was a young man, not much older than Raphael. For a second, a look of confusion crossed his face, as if he couldn't understand why such beautiful music was happening in such a terrible place. Then he just walked away. Alice let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She realized then that music was powerful. It was more powerful than the guards and their guns. It could reach into the hardest heart and soften it, even if just for a moment. Word began to spread through the camp. The pianist from Prague plays in the yellow building. People would stand outside the windows just to listen. They would lean their heads against the cold brick walls to hear the muffled sounds of the piano drifting outside. It gave them something to hold on to. It gave them a memory of what life used to be like. Alice knew she couldn't keep the music to herself forever. The rumors were true that the Nazis wanted to organize concerts for the inspectors. They wanted to show the world how cultured the camp was. Alice knew it was a lie, but she didn't care. If they wanted a show, she would give them a show. She would play with everything she had. Not for them, but for the people in the barracks. For the people who had lost hope, she started to prepare mentally. She chose her repertoire. The weeks leading up to the big performance were filled with a strange kind of chaos. The Nazis were nervous. Word had spread that important visitors were coming to inspect the camp. These visitors were from the Red Cross, an organization from the outside world that checked on how people were being treated. The Nazis wanted to fool them. They wanted to make the camp look like a normal, happy place rather than a prison. So, they began a frantic process of beautification. Alice watched from the window of the barracks as they started to paint the walls. They painted over the cracks and the dirt with bright, fresh colors, trying to hide the sickness that lived inside. They planted flowers in the muddy yards flowers that were dug up by trembling prisoners who had no energy to dig. They even opened a new cafe, but only for the show. It was a theater of lies. The prisoners were forced to act in this play. They were given clean clothes to wear for the day clothes that had been taken from people who had already been killed or sent away to the east. It felt wrong to wear them, but they had no choice. Alice was told that she would be one of the main acts. She was to play the piano at a special concert organized for the visitors. The pressure was heavy on her shoulders. She wasn't just playing for herself anymore, and she wasn't just playing for the few people hiding in the back room. She was being used as a prop in a Nazi propaganda film. They wanted to show the world that the Jews were living a cultural life and that they were being treated well. It made Alice angry, but she swallowed that anger. She knew she could use this. If the world saw her playing, they would see that art still existed, that the human spirit was not broken. But more importantly, she could play for her fellow prisoners. The night before the concert, Alice could barely sleep. The bunk was hard, and the room was loud, with snoring and coughing, but her mind was racing. She went over the music in her head one last time. She had chosen to play a complex piece by Chopin. It was full of difficult runs and deep emotions. It was music that required strength, and Alice knew she was strong. She looked over at Raphael, who was curled up beside her. He was fast asleep, his thumb in his mouth. She promised herself that the next day she would play for him. She would play so that the music would wrap around him like a warm blanket and keep the nightmares away. On the day of the concert, the atmosphere in the camp was tense. The prisoners who were chosen to be in the audience were herded into the large hall. They looked tired and thin, but they had scrubbed their faces clean. They sat on rows of wooden benches, waiting. The hall was dimly lit, but the stage had bright spotlights shining on it. In the center of the stage sat the old brown piano. It looked out of place under the bright lights, like a dusty relic trying to shine. At the back of the hall stood the Nazi officers. They were in their crisp uniforms, looking stiff and serious. They were watching the crowd like hawks, making sure no one stepped out of line. They wanted this concert to go perfectly. They wanted to show off their model prison. Alice stood backstage, waiting for her name to be called. She smoothed down her skirt, which was the best one she had left. Her hands were shaking a little, so she hid them in her pockets. She took deep breaths, telling herself to be calm. She wasn't Alice the prisoner anymore. She was Alice the musician. Finally, the announcer spoke. His voice echoed through the hall. There was a polite applause, mostly from the soldiers. Alice walked out onto the stage. The spotlight hit her face, blinding her for a moment. She couldn't see the audience clearly, but she could feel them. She could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes staring at her. She walked to the piano, bowed stiffly, and sat down on the bench. As she placed her fingers on the keys, a strange thing happened. The room went still. It wasn't just that people stopped talking. It was a deeper silence. The air seemed to stop moving. The guards stopped whispering to each other. The prisoners in the front rows leaned forward slightly. Even the sounds from outside the wind, the distant shouting, seemed to vanish. It was a silence filled with expectation. It was the silence of 100 hearts beating at the same time, waiting to see what would happen next. For a second, Alice felt a flash of panic. What if her hands were too stiff? What if she made a mistake? But then she remembered why she was there. She wasn't there for the Nazis. She was there for the hungry souls sitting in the darkness. She took a breath, and then she began to play. The first notes of the Chopin etude rang out, cutting through the dusty air like a knife. They were sharp and clear. Alice's fingers moved faster, pressing down on the keys with a force she didn't know she still had. The music was not gentle. It was bold and demanding. It surged through the hall like a wave. Slowly, the atmosphere in the room began to change. The stiffness in the air started to dissolve. The people in the audience closed their eyes. They stopped seeing the gray walls of the prison. They stopped seeing the guards with the guns. For the prisoners in the hall, the music was a magic trick. As the melody swelled, they were no longer in theirs instead. One woman, her head wrapped in a dirty scarf, saw herself back in her own kitchen, making soup for her family. An old man with a white beard remembered the sound of the birds in the garden where he used to sit. They were transported away from the horror, if only for a few minutes. The music was telling a story of struggle and hope. It climbed up high, tense, and difficult, like the climb of a mountain, and then it would cascade down, beautiful and free. Alice played with every ounce of energy she had left. She wasn't just hitting notes. She was pouring her life force into the instrument. She played her fear, her anger, and her love. The silence of the room had transformed. It was no longer a heavy, suffocating silence. It had become a living, breathing space. The room felt alive. The music vibrated through the wooden floorboards and into the feet of the audience. It connected them all, the guards, the prisoners, the visitors, and Alice. For that brief moment, they were just people listening to a song. Alice looked out at the blur of faces. She saw tears glistening on the cheeks of the women in the front row. She saw the guards standing still, their hands resting on their rifles, their expressions unreadable, but their attention locked on the music. The music didn't care who was listening. It didn't judge. It just was. She played on and on. Her fingers danced, they flew, they hammered the keys. The sounds cascaded like a waterfall of notes, washing away the grime and the despair. The physical hunger faded, replaced by a spiritual hunger that was being fed. It was a feeling of unity, In that moment, no one was alone. Everyone was tied together by the thread of the melody as she reached the final. Most difficult part of the piece, the music grew intense. It was loud, thundering through the small hall. Alice's body swayed with the rhythm. She felt a power surge through her, a power that didn't come from food or rest, but from deep inside her spirit. She was fighting back. The only way she knew how to fight was not with a gun, but with beauty. Then came the ending. The fast, loud notes stopped. The final chords were struck, ringing out with authority and grace. Alice held her hands in the air for a moment, letting the vibration of the strings fade into the air. The room went still again. But this time, it was different. The heavy, fearful silence was gone. In its place was a stunned, sacred quiet. It was the silence you feel after a storm has passed and the sky clears. For a long second, no one moved. No one clapped. The beauty of what had just happened hung in the air like smoke. The music had brought the room to life, and now that the music had stopped, the life didn't disappear. It stayed there in the hearts of the people listening. They had been reminded that they were human. They had been reminded that there was still beauty in the world, even in this terrible place. Slowly, the applause began. It didn't start with the soldiers. It started with the prisoners. It was a clapping of hands that were raw and rough, but they clapped with a genuine emotion. It grew louder, filling the hall. Alice stood up. She was sweating, and her chest was heaving, but she felt light. She looked out into the darkness and imagined she saw Raphael smiling. She had done it. She had turned the stone walls into a cathedral of sound for a few precious minutes. As she walked off the stage, the noise of the camp rushed back in the shouting, the doors slamming, but it sounded different now. It was further away. Alice knew that tomorrow the hunger would return and the cold would be back. But tonight, for a short while, the music had won. The room had gone still, and then, against all odds, it had come to life. The applause faded away, but the feeling in the air did not. Alice walked back to her place in the dark corners of the hall, her heart beating faster than it had when she was playing. As she sat down on the hard wooden bench next to Raphael, she felt a hand reach out and grab hers. It was the hand of the woman sitting next to her. The woman didn't say anything. She just squeezed Alice's hand tight. In the darkness of the hall, Alice could feel the woman's shoulders shaking. She was crying. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief. For a few minutes, the music had lifted the heavy stone roof off their shoulders. It had let them breathe. The Nazi officers were not so moved. As soon as the concert was over, the magic was broken. They shouted orders for the prisoners to return to their barracks. The beautification was only for the show. Once the visitors had left and the cameras were packed away, the harsh reality of the camp came crashing back in. The lights were turned off, and the spotlights that had made the piano shine disappeared. The hall was just a cold, dusty room again, but something had changed inside the people. As they marched back to their sleeping quarters, the silence was different. It wasn't the empty silence of despair. It was a quiet buzz of conversation. People were whispering about the music. They were talking about the Chopin piece, about the way the piano had sounded, about the way Alice had looked when she played. The music had given them something to talk about other than hunger and death. It had given them a memory that belonged to them, not to the Nazis. The days that followed were some of the hardest. The winter began to set in, bringing with it a biting cold that seeped through the thin walls of the barracks and into everyone's bones. Food became even scarcer, if that was possible. The soup was more like water, and the bread was often moldy. Sickness spread through the camp like wildfire. People coughed until their chests hurt, and many were too weak to stand for roll call. Alice felt the exhaustion deep in her marrow. Her fingers, usually so nimble and strong, became stiff and chapped from the cold. Some days she didn't think she could lift her hands, let alone play a piano. But every time she felt like giving up, she looked at Raphael. He was getting thinner, his cheekbones showing more sharply every day. His eyes were losing the spark of childhood. She knew she had to keep going. She had to keep the music alive because it was the only shield. She had to protect him. She continued to go to the yellow building whenever she was allowed. She practiced on the old upright piano, even when the room was freezing cold. She would wear her coat and gloves with the fingers cut off to keep her hands warm while she played. She wasn't playing for an audience anymore. She was playing to keep her own soul from freezing over. She played because as long as she could play, she was a human being, not a number. She played because the music gave her hope that the war would end, that they would survive, that one day they would be free. Then the rumors started. They whispered through the camp like a gentle breeze. People said that the Allied armies were closing in. They said the Nazis were losing the war. At first, Alice was afraid to believe it. She had been disappointed so many times before, but then the mood of the guards changed. They looked nervous. They stopped shouting so much. They stopped the beatings. The camp, which had been a tightly run machine of terror, began to fall apart. One morning, Alice woke up to a strange sound. She looked out of the high window and saw something she hadn't seen in years. A radio was playing in the commandant's office, and it wasn't playing German marching music. It was playing news. The guards were arguing. Some of them were running away, abandoning their posts. The fear that had gripped the prisoners for so long had shifted. Now, it was the guards who were afraid. The day of liberation was not a single dramatic moment like in a movie. It happened slowly. The gates of the camp were thrown open. The barbed wire fences that had separated them from the rest of the world were cut down. There was no army marching in with trumpets at that exact moment. Instead, there was a realization. The realization that the monsters were gone. Alice stood in the middle of the muddy yard with Raphael. She looked around. The camp was quiet. The shouting had stopped. The dogs were silent. The sky above was gray, but to Alice, it looked beautiful. She took a deep breath. The air still smelled of coal and smoke, but it was free air. She squeezed Raphael's hand. "It's over," she whispered. "We are going to live." The journey back to the real world was difficult. They were free, but they had nowhere to go. The city of Prague had changed. Their old apartment was gone, occupied by someone else. Many of their friends and family members had not survived. The world they had known before the war had been shattered. It was a time of great sadness for Alice. She had saved her son. She had saved herself. But the loss was heavy. In the months and years that followed, Alice made a choice. She could have been bitter. She could have spent the rest of her life hating the people who had done this to her. She could have been angry at the world for letting it happen. But she looked at the piano again, and she realized something important. She realized that hate is a heavy burden to carry. It wears you down. Music, on the other hand, lifts you up. Alice decided that she would not let the Nazis steal her joy. They had taken her home, her career, and her freedom, but they could not take her love for music or her love for people. She moved to a new city, started a new life, and continued to play. She became a teacher again. She taught her students that music was more than just notes on a page. It was a way to find peace inside yourself, no matter what is happening outside your window. She grew old, very old. Her hair turned white as snow, and her steps became slow, but her hands never lost their magic. She still played the piano every day. She lived a long life, becoming a witness to history. People would come from all over the world to sit in her small living room and listen to her play. They wanted to know how she survived such a terrible place. How did she keep going when everyone else was dying? She would always smile her gentle smile and point to the piano. "I did not survive because I was strong," she would say. "I survived because I was optimistic, and I had my music." She would tell them the story of the camp. She would tell them about the hunger, the cold, and the fear. But she would always tell them about the concert. She would tell them about the room going still. She would explain that in the midst of all that ugliness, there was beauty. And that beauty was what kept them alive. Alice believed that laughter is the medicine of life, but music is the food. She never spoke a bad word about anyone. She forgave, not because the Nazis deserved it, but because she deserved to be free from hate. She knew that as long as she could sit at the piano and make a melody, her heart was free. Near the end of her life, someone asked her what the secret to a long and happy life was. She thought for a moment, her hands resting on her knees, ready to play. She said, "I look at the good. When you are a lover of music, you are always looking for harmony. Even in a noisy world, you can find your own rhythm if you listen hard enough." When Alice finally passed away, she was over 100 years old. The world mourned her, but also celebrated her. She left behind a legacy that wasn't about war or suffering. It was about the power of the human spirit to create light in the darkness. The story of that room in the camp. The room that went still is a story for everyone. Life will always have its dark moments. There will be times when the world feels cold and the noise of fear is loud. There will be times when we feel trapped or hopeless. But Alice showed us that even in the stillest, darkest room, we have the power to bring it to life. We all have a piano inside us. It might not be a musical instrument. It might be our kindness, our art, our writing, or just our ability to love others. It is that thing that makes us feel most alive. When the world goes still around us, we have to play. We have to play with everything we have. We have to create beauty to drown out the ugliness. Alice's music did more than just entertain. It transformed a place of death into a place of life, if only for an hour. It proved to the prisoners and to the guards and to history itself that the human soul cannot be chained. It can be tired, it can be hungry, and it can be afraid, but it can still sing, and that is the true power of art. It connects us. It heals us. It reminds us that we are not alone. When Alice sat down on that bench and closed her eyes, she wasn't just a prisoner in a striped uniform. She was a queen of melody. She brought that stone room to life, and in doing so, she kept the hope alive for thousands of people. The room went still. Yes, the world held its breath. But then the music started. And as long as there are people like Alice, people who choose hope over hate and beauty over despair, the music will never stop. The room will always come to life.